The silence in a federal holding cell in Brooklyn has a specific frequency. It is the sound of a $50 million bounty finally being collected. It is the sound of a man who once commanded the largest oil reserves on the planet, realizing that, in the end, his loyalty was an asset with a plummeting market value. On January 3, 2026, the world watched the handcuffs click shut on Nicolas Maduro. But the story of his downfall didn't begin with a Delta Force operation or a political coup. It began with a mathematical impossibility. Now imagine a vault. Inside this vault sits 300 billion barrels of liquid gold. It is a prize so vast that if you distributed its value, every single citizen in your country would never have to work a day in their lives. You are the custodian of the ultimate lottery ticket. And yet, 10 years later, your people are eating zoo animals to survive. The engineers are washing dishes in Miami, and your currency is being used as literal toilet paper because the paper it's printed on is more valuable than the number it represents. You haven't just lost a fortune. You have managed to delete 80% of a nation's entire economic existence in a single decade. This isn't just a story of a failed politician. This is the forensic audit of a spectacular financial collapse. We are going to look past the propaganda and into the cold, hard mechanics of how you win the ultimate lottery and still end up in a cell. This is the economy that nailed Maduro. To understand the wreckage of 2026, we have to go back to the moment the trap was set. In the world of behavioral finance, there is a phenomenon known as the resource curse. It suggests that the more wealth you find in the ground, the less intelligence you use in the office. When Maduro took the wheel in 2013, he didn't just inherit a country, he inherited a drug because Venezuela was addicted to oil. For decades, the nation had suffered from a terminal case of Dutch disease. Why build factories? Why plant corn? Why educate scientists when you can just stick a straw in the ground and buy everything you need from someone else? Venezuela had stopped being a country and had become a giant oil-fueled ATM. But Maduro did something far more dangerous than just being an addict. He fired the pharmacists. In a fit of ideological ego, the government had purged nearly 20,000 engineers and geologists from PDVSA, the state oil company. These weren't just employees, they were the collective brain of the nation's only source of income. They were replaced by political loyalists, men who knew how to chant slogans at a rally, but couldn't explain the thermodynamics of a high-pressure crude pipeline if their lives depended on it. Now imagine you own a Boeing 747, and to prove your authority, you fire the pilots and mechanics and hand the controls to the flight attendants because they're more loyal to your leadership. You might stay at 30,000 feet for a few minutes on autopilot, but eventually the law of gravity is going to present its bill. When Maduro took office, the autopilot was already failing, production was sliding, the infrastructure was rusting from the inside out. But instead of fixing the rigs, Maduro treated the oil company like a personal piggy bank to fund his survival. He completely deleted the maintenance budgets to pay for propaganda and raided the pension funds to buy the silence of the generals. By the time the world looked at the data in 2024, production had collapsed from 3 million barrels a day to a pathetic trickle. He had killed the golden goose, plucked it, deep-fried it, and then stood in front of the cameras, wondering why there were no more eggs. But the oil collapse was only the first nail. The second was what I call the money printer trap. When the oil revenue crashed in 2014, Maduro faced the ultimate psychological test of a leader. Tell the people the truth or lie to the math. Guess it? He chose to lie. He looked at the central bank and gave a simple command. Print it. This wasn't just inflation. This was economic velocity that broke the speedometer of human comprehension. In 2013, inflation was a worrying 56%, but by 2019, the IMF reported it had hit a staggering 1.3 million%. Let's make that number feel real. Imagine you go to bed on a Monday and an egg costs like $1. By Friday, that same egg costs $3,000. Prices weren't changing by the year or the month, they were changing by the hour. Waiters in Caracas restaurants stopped giving out menus because the price of the steak would double by the time you finished your appetizer. Can you even imagine living like this? Holding a bolívar became like holding a block of dry ice. It would evaporate in your hand. People started weaving purses and bird cages out of stacks of cash because the craft value of the paper was higher than the face value of the currency. Maduro declared an economic war on reality. He blamed shopkeepers, the CIA, and capitalist parasites. In addition to that, he sent soldiers to force stores to lower their prices. But basic economics has a brutal comeback. If you force a man to sell a TV for $10, when it costs him $100 to buy it, he doesn't lower the price. He just closes the store. The shelves went bare. The trust died. And when the money dies, the hunger begins. This is where the forensic audit turns from a financial tragedy into a humanitarian horror show. In 2016, the world learned a new term, the Maduro diet. A major university study revealed that 75% of the population had lost an average of 19 pounds in a single year. Not because they were at the gym, but because they were skipping meals. However, Maduro didn't see a tragedy. He saw an opportunity. He created the CLAP boxes, subsidized food packages delivered directly to homes. It was the ultimate weaponization of scarcity. This cardboard box of low-quality flour and oil became the most powerful political tool in the country. If you protested, no box. If you didn't vote for the party, the truck broke down in your neighborhood. He turned starvation into a business model, and while children were fainting in schools from malnutrition, his inner circle was getting rich off the markups on this low-quality food. It was cynical, it was brutal, and it was the third nail in the coffin. When a house is on fire, you don't stay to argue about the color of the curtains. You jump. By 2018, the exodus had begun. Since 2014, roughly 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That is 1/4 of the entire population. To contextualize that, imagine if every single person in the state of Texas just packed a bag and walked across the border. This was the largest human displacement in the history of the Western Hemisphere, and there wasn't a single bomb dropped. The bomb was the economic policy, but the real cost wasn't just the number of people. It was the human capital hemorrhage. The doctors, the surgeons, the teachers, and the technicians, the very people you need to rebuild a country, were the first to leave. Maduro was left ruling a kingdom of ghosts and the elderly. He didn't just lose money, he lost the brain power required to ever get it back. Then the lights went out. Literally. In March 2019, the Guri Dam, which supplies 80% of the country's power, failed. For nearly a week, Venezuela went dark. Maduro claimed it was a cybernetic attack, orchestrated from a laptop in Washington. The reality was much more boring and much more terrifying. It was negligence. They had stopped cutting the grass around the substations, leading to fires. They had stopped replacing the turbines. For 5 days, neonatal incubators turned off. Dialysis machines stopped. People were seen scooping water from the Guari River, a river so polluted it is essentially liquid sewage, just to flush their toilets. The state had failed to provide the two most basic requirements of a civilization: light and water. The social contract wasn't just broken, it was shredded. But if the oil was gone and the people were fleeing, how did the regime survive until 2026? To stay in power, Maduro had to embrace the devil's deal. He quietly legalized the US dollar, the very symbol of the empire he claimed to hate. This created a zombie economy. Walk down one street in Caracas and you'd see people digging through trash for food. Walk down the next and you'd see a bodegon selling PlayStation 5s, Kirkland vitamins, and imported champagne for dollars. It was a bubble of luxury built on money laundering and remittances, giving the illusion that Venezuela is fixed, but a country cannot survive on Nutella imports and dirty cash. When the oil money finally dried up, Maduro looked at a map of the Amazon and said, "Dig it." He created the Orinoco mining arc, a zone bigger than Portugal, and handed it over to a mix of military generals and criminal syndicates. They used toxic mercury to extract gold, poisoning the water of indigenous tribes and destroying one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. This gold wasn't for the people, it was blood gold, flown out on private planes to be sold for untraceable cash to keep the inner circle loyal. The economy was no longer based on GDP, it was based on extraction. Extract the oil, extract the gold, extract the hope. The final act of this tragedy began in 2024. For a brief moment, there was a glimmer of hope. The Barbados Agreement offered a path out of the darkness. Hold a free election, and the world will lift the sanctions. The economy could finally breathe. On July 28, 2024, the people of Venezuela did the unthinkable. They showed up in numbers that made the regime's propaganda impossible to sustain. Edmundo Gonzalez didn't just win, he delivered a landslide. Maduro had a golden key in his hand to unlock the future of his country. He could have negotiated an amnesty, retired to a beach in Turkey, and let the recovery begin. Instead, he chose to flip the table. He stole the vote, arrested the protesters, and snapped the sanctions back into place. This was the moment the opportunity cost became terminal. He proved to his own military that as long as he was in charge, the money would never return. He was the blockage in the pipe. As we entered late 2025, the economic math finally hit zero. History teaches us that you can survive being hated, but you cannot survive when your own bodyguards realize you are a liability. The cartel of the Suns, the high-ranking officers who wore sun insignias on their shoulders, realized that a $15 million bounty from the U.S. Department of Justice was the only liquid asset left in the building. The incentive structure had flipped. For a decade, the incentive was to protect the king. On January 3, 2026, the incentive was to sell him. The Delta Force extraction that dominated the headlines was simply the final movement of a symphony that had been playing for 10 years. The regime didn't fall to a bullet. It fell to a forensic audit. Nicolás Maduro is in a cell today because he believed he could rule over ruins forever. He thought he could print wealth. He thought he could eat oil. And he thought the laws of reality didn't apply to a revolution. But he was wrong. Here is the final bill. GDP contracted by 80%, poverty at 90%, 8 million people in exile, a currency that ceased to exist. There is no courtroom on earth big enough to hold the true scale of what has been lost. You cannot refund a stolen decade. You cannot put a price on the empty chairs at millions of dinner tables. The economy that nailed Maduro also nailed the Venezuelan people to a cross of suffering. As the lights slowly flicker back on in Caracas and the rebuilding begins, the story of Venezuela stands as a warning to the rest of the world. Economics isn't just about spreadsheets and interest rates. It is about the lifeblood of a civilization. When you destroy the trust in a currency, you destroy the trust in your neighbor. When you prioritize loyalty over competence, you eventually run out of people who know how to keep the lights on. Maduro is gone, but the wreckage remains. And the story of how Venezuela clears that rubble will be just as wild as the story of how it was created. If you found this forensic deep dive valuable, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this truth is worth watching. Hit subscribe to be here for the next chapter, because in the end, math always wins. I'll see you in the comments.